Hello and welcome to your third lecture on the EPQ. So at this particular stage you should have understood some of the basics of the EPQ course. From that particular point you've then hopefully started to narrow down some topic areas and try to form some questions. At this particular stage what we will be asking you to do is starting to think about how you can begin your initial EPQ research, how you can get yourself organised when you're conducting that research, and also what you need to be doing with your production logs. So we have already stated that there are 4 different assessment objectives and that your EPQ is marked holistically. Assessment objective 1 is about managing your topic, and you can see that the first bullet point is about identifying the topic. And if you're wanting to get the top marks, you need to clearly identify the topic to be investigated and researched with clear evidence of appropriate aims and objectives for the proposed project title. And that also includes a detailed project plan. Now, if you're doing your production log, you can be completing the record of initial ideas, those first few boxes, before sending it to me, and I can give you some advice, which will be where it says from the supervisor. So my tips for doing that record of initial ideas are: don't embellish what you've done, so don't exaggerate. Likewise, don't undersell what you've done so far. Don't make it a list, put it into continuous prose, and it's okay to almost think out loud. So I was originally thinking of this topic and now I've changed my mind, and now I'm thinking of doing this particular thing, but I'm aware that there's some problems with this question. So you're trying to be as honest as possible. Make reference to specific research that you've read, your thought process, what else you've considered. That specific research, don't just say books or the internet. Talk about where you've specifically gone. Don't be afraid to say that you've made changes to your ideas and your plan. That's really important. It's good. It shows that you can take advice on board. It shows that you're not dogmatic, but pragmatic instead. You're willing to change and adapt your processes. So you should be doing that. If you haven't done that already, I would suggest that you just make some notes, and once you've got some particular ideas, you can send it to me. This particular video, though, is not going to focus in on just those that record of initial ideas page. Instead, it's about thinking how you can start researching and how you're going to start organising that research. Now, when we're talking about research, we generally categorise it into 2 separate areas, and we've got primary or secondary data. Now, for the purposes of this particular video, we're going to be focusing in on secondary data. There will be a further lecture which will focus in on primary data, but primary data isn't necessary for all EPQs, but secondary research is. So it might be the case that you're thinking of doing an artifact, and primary data is something that you might need to collect. But for the vast majority of people, those particularly doing essay questions, so the 5,000 word essays, the vast majority of information that you'll be getting will be from secondary data. So that's where we need to start. Now, primary data is information that has been observed or collected from first-hand experience. So that's what you do. Now, if you're doing secondary data, that's something that's collected or made by somebody else. Now, that's okay. We're not writing a PhD dissertation, so therefore we don't need to do primary data. So secondary data is where we start. The reason why we're doing it is because if you're starting to research what other people have said about that topic, it will give you ideas for a question. It might be that you've got a general topic area, but you're not sure about the question itself. Likewise, it will give you an understanding about what other researchers have done in your area, and perhaps some areas where there might not be that much information. So you might have a question that you think is quite good, but unfortunately there isn't that much to write on it. So I've had people before wanting to focus in on very specific musical questions or things that they're interested in. They've done some research and found that there isn't actually that much secondary research that they can analyse and evaluate. It's important for students to have their perspectives broadened. It might set work in context as well. It will be really important to have that, because direct personal experiences are never enough to give you a decent mark for an EPQ. Fortunately, a few years ago I had a student that wanted to do an EPQ about luck and traditions and routines in sport, and they weren't taking on board advice, and they did a lot of their research based on personal experiences that they'd had with sport. That wasn't appropriate. That wasn't something that got them very good marks at all. It's also important to give legitimacy to your argument. So if you're finding out research, and the arguments that you're going to be creating need to be based on solid evidence and solid factual claims. It might cause you to change your mind. That's really important. You should be going into this with an open mind and no real fixed arguments already or conclusions already drawn. So it's important to have research so that you actually form these arguments and conclusions for yourself. Good writers need to be good readers, and the more that you read, the better you'll become at forming those longer essays and longer writing styles. You'll see how people are able to form them. It's important as well, because if you're able to criticize what others have done, then it's likely that you'll get higher marks as well. That'll be useful for AO2. It will give you more information about research methods, their application in practice, so that will help you with your A-level courses as well. And it will hopefully be able to spot areas that might not have been researched before, might give you that little bit of an edge. And finally, and the most important reason, is that for the EPQ, you should be roughly looking at about 40 different sources of information. So it's best to start now. So it's really important that you have that range of different sources so that you can show that off when you're submitting that work to be assessed, because we'll be looking at not just your essay but your production log, your presentation, and you can talk about all those different sources and which ones you selected, deselected at that stage. Now, where you can go for your research, a lot of people will start off by doing one thing and one thing alone, and this is kind of a major pitfall that students have when they do the EPQ. They log onto the internet, they type it in onto Google, they find website articles, and that's it. Now, that isn't going to give you that range that's going to give you the top marks for your EPQ. Instead, we need to be trying to utilize research from a variety of different topics. So the internet, textbooks, books, academic journals, newspapers, TV, YouTube, social media. That's really a range of different source areas. But I am aware that at the moment under lockdown, it might be difficult for you to access books or go to a library, and it might be that the internet not only is your first port of call, but maybe your only port of call at the moment. And so with that in mind, we need to ensure that we understand how we can use the internet effectively and what kind of tricks we can use on the internet to get all of that information that we need. It is possible to use the internet as your sole resource, because you can get books, journals, newspaper articles, lots of different types of sources from the internet. But my really big advice is that once lockdown is over, you should be going to a library and you should be using books. Books are far, far better at giving you more information and giving you more ideas than just website articles. That being said, though, let's just talk about how you can perhaps use the internet effectively. Now, you might already know some of these tips, and there's plenty of YouTube tutorials that you can go on to about how you can research quickly using the internet, but I'll go through 4 useful activities and strategies that you can use. The first is to be Google search smart. Now, what I'm meaning by that is a lot of people will just type in a really long question into Google and expect to see answers that come from it. There's a really good function that's at the end of Google, where if you're interested in a topic, what you need to do is you need to write, and I'm sorry about having to try and draw what I want to say, is you need to type in file type. Hopefully you can read what I've drawn there. File type, and then colon. And what you'll do is you'll be able to search for a very specific type of document that's going to lead you to find academic articles. So let's say that you're interested in that topic that we looked at last time, which was vexillology and flags, and maybe the rainbow flag of South Africa. If you type that into Google, you'll come up with all the basics, so Encyclopedia, Britannica, Wikipedia, BBC, nothing really that's going to make you stand apart. If you, at the very end of what you've typed in, put file type and then put PDF, it will only search for PDF files that relate to that particular term. Likewise, you can replace PDF with DOC, so doc, and that will search for just Word documents. Academic scholars, when they're writing things online, they very rarely put them as web pages and instead upload them onto the internet as PDF documents or as Word documents. So I'd recommend, when you're doing your research to have that tool at your disposal. The other things to say about Google as well is that you can access the Google Book and Google Scholar functions, which look for academic titles and academic journals that relate to those specific topics. So Google does obviously have its main web search function, but you can also use the different tabs that are at the top. Now, Wikipedia is something that has a lot of people worried when they're approaching dissertations and projects and long questions. But it is useful if it's done right. So Wikipedia you should never reference as a source itself. The reason why is because Wikipedia is made up of collaborations and submissions from anyone that has the login details. Now they're trying to be fact checked, so they're trying to be as accurate as possible. And what they do is they usually have footnotes and a bibliography at the end of a page. So where I'm saying do use Wikipedia, what I'm meaning is, if you've got a specific topic area, again like vexillology or the Union flag, if you go to Wikipedia, at the very bottom there will be a contents page. There will be links to books that or articles or web pages that the Wikipedia article has been formed from. Now Wikipedia isn't designed to persuade people, it's just designed to inform, but those links perhaps will give you more persuasive writing pieces. So if you are going to use Wikipedia, use the links which are at the bottom. But again, it's not a definitive concrete list of factually accurate sources, so there might be biases that are attached to them, so we have to be wary of them. We'll talk about how we can approach them effectively in a later lecture. If you are using the internet, you can use the Google Books function. There are contents pages and index pages, and if you press Control F, you can find certain words in pages. So rather than having to read an entire book, if you use Control F, you can see where the relevant pages are. Likewise, index pages, contents pages, so many people just gloss over that and think that they have to read the full book. That's not necessary. So when I'm saying 40 sources, doesn't mean you have to read 40 books back to front. And finally, know those basic terms. Where I've said Control F and search for a specific word, when you're looking for a topic area, make sure that you've got a list of basic terms that you're scanning for. So when you're reading through text, you're looking for those particular terms, because those are the ones that perhaps are going to give you those pieces of information that are going to help with those persuasive writing parts. Now, I have just mentioned there about reading quickly. And if you are going to be looking through lots of different sources, we need to get into habits of how to read quickly, but also effectively. So it's not just about skim reading, it's also about making sure that we're doing this to a good standard and that we're recording it properly as well. So I'm just going to go through a technique called SQ3R, which is a reading method. And if you are interested by this and you haven't found this YouTube video to be absolutely clear, type that in onto Google. There's really good tutorials just on SQ3R and that you can find more about. Now, this is a technique that's really shown at university standard and it's taught to students then, but there's no reason why you can't have it for the EPQ now. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to survey the titles, the subheading, the images, the charts of the overall page, and it might be that you just want to scan the page first just to see what the general gist is like. Is it professional? Is it something that's going to give you that information? And importantly, are those keywords jumping out at you to make it appear as though this is going to be a website, a book, a journal that's going to be worth investing more time reading into? It's really important that we don't just read everything cover to cover right from the start. So either survey or scan through at the very start. Once you've done that, start creating questions about what you want from the text. So if you're reading a website article and it's on, again, the topic of vexillology and flags, it might be the case that you want to find out a little bit about the history of the Union flag at this particular point. So that's what you want to get at the end of this. There's no point just aimlessly reading lots of different sources. It's really important that we have that clear focus at the start. So the surveying and the questions is actually done before we do what we would expect to have done right at the start, which is read the information. And reading, recalling and reviewing make up those 3 R's, the final things of this reading method. So of the 3 R's, firstly you need to read with the aim of answering that specific question, and that is from start to finish. If there are words that you're a bit unsure about, take your time, have a look on the go to a dictionary, type it in onto Google, see what those words mean. If you know from the start this is something that when you've done your surveying and scanning that you're not going to read with a finite amount of detail, then it's okay to do that reading stage as a bit of a scan. You then need to recall aloud the answers to your questions so that it's given you that information. And it would be worth as well at this particular point under the recall stage to write down what has been said in this particular source, and we'll talk about that in the next few slides. Finally, it's important to review the text at a later date so that you've got it in a format that you can review from. So it's important that when you've read something, you recall it, you put it in a format that you can recall from, and that you then go and review it at a later date. So that's the whole process of SQ3R, and likewise you can go and find more information if you want it. Now, in terms of advice about how to make those notes from the source that you're reading, there's some excellent books out there which will give you advice more so than just this YouTube video. So this one from Pearson, for example, How to Write Dissertations and Project Reports by Macmillan and Weyers, is very, very good. It's more designed for undergraduate students, but it's definitely useful for the EPQ. Really, really good if you're wanting to get those top marks. So the advice that they've given is down really to these 5. Firstly, notes are resources, so don't throw them away. If you're reading something, make sure that you are taking a note of it and that you're putting it into somewhere where it's easily accessible. So I was somebody that was never good at recording information on paper. I always wanted to have something on a computer. So if I was making notes at university, I would have folders, and the folders would be under subcategories, and I could find everything there. If you're somebody that works better in paper, or it's going to be easier or quicker to do that, then again, make sure that you've got those folders ready. Make sure that you've got the different tabs that divide certain areas that you're looking at. Use white space effectively. So you shouldn't be cramming that page so that it's completely full of just writing. Make sure that you use the white space to perhaps do visual clues. So if you're doing a topic again on vexillology and it's on the Union flag and it's on a specific component, so it might be on the lack of the Welsh flag, I might just want to draw a little sketch in the white space of that particular page of a Welsh flag. And linking to that point, make them visually striking as well. We want to be able to look back at these, review and recall the information by looking at something that's going to be exciting to look at. So the reason why I always did things on the internet was because my handwriting was shockingly poor. It was never good to read through my own notes. So if I typed it up, made sure that it was in the same format, you'll notice from my PowerPoints that they're always in the same style. That always helps me if I'm trying to go back through the information. The final 2 points that Macmillan and Weyers go through are the ones that I'd like to go through in this particular, the rest of the time for this video. It's about how you can develop your own shorthand and how you can develop a note-taking system that is going to be far quicker and far more useful for you. And then finally, how you can organise your notes in a similar system. Now, this particular task has come from I think it's Portsmouth University, and I've got the link at the bottom, and I would recommend that you take a bit of time to have a look through their guide. But what I'd like you to do is I'd like you, after I've explained this task, to pause the video, have a go in your booklets. You've got this particular task, and see how you get on. So I'd like you to use abbreviations to cut the paragraph that's in front of you on this screen down. I'd like you to cut it down to such a degree that you can summarise that particular paragraph in a single line of writing. So I'm not going to read through the paragraph, but you've got on the screen a number of abbreviations that you could potentially use. But it's okay if you want to use your own as well. So if you pause the video now, have a go in your booklet, and then I'll talk a little bit about what shorthand techniques you can use and where you can find them. Now this is the text that you've got, but summarised into a single line. Now, I didn't read through the paragraph deliberately because I didn't want to remember exactly what it said, but I'm wondering now whether or not I can read this particular sentence and essentially get the gist of the entire paragraph. So I've got here, end of the 20th century, the UK population is roughly around 60 million, which equates kind of similar to Italy. so that's that capital I. But in Italy, there is a population decline due to the fact that the death rate is larger than the birth rate, which is different compared to the UK's, which is increasing at a slow rate each particular year, and that's of 0.09% between 1995 and 2000. Now, I've kind of taken a leap of faith there because I haven't read that particular paragraph for a while, so I don't know if I've got it completely right, but that essentially is what we call shorthand. That's taking abbreviations so that when you're reading back through something, you can get all of that information. And the benefit of that is that it's a lot quicker to write in shorthand for your own notes than it is to write down and copy the entire thing. It's a useful skill to have as well at A level, because if you're listening to what a teacher says, you can quickly take notes at the same time. Now, you can create your own abbreviations. There's a handy list at that particular link which is on the screen, and you can pause and type that in if you want to. But you can create your own, and actually that's probably the best way of doing this. If you create your own abbreviations, if you create your own shorthand style that works for you, then it's going to be far better. Now, likewise as well, there's amazing technology that's available for you that wasn't available a while ago. And if you go onto Word documents, and if you've got a Windows 10 computer, you'll find that you've got things like a dictate function, and your phones have this function as well. So what you can do is you can speak into your phone and it will take the notes for you. That's an incredibly good feature to have, and something else that you can use if you're wanting to write down notes or get down basic points. Now, in terms of how to record this research, we're going to go through 4 different note-taking methods. So these are, what you've got here is about writing in shorthand, but let's say that you've got an entire chapter that you want to read. How are you going to organise your thoughts from that particular chapter? You're not just going to write down perhaps those particular lines one after the other in a book. That wouldn't make sense for you. Now, what I'm going to suggest that you do for this is that we take something that we're going to take some notes from, and then what we'll do is we'll apply some of these note-taking models. Now, in your booklets you've got the 4 note-taking methods, and I'll talk about what they are after I've explained the task. And what I want you to do is I want you to watch the clip, the YouTube clip which is provided, and the reason why I selected this is because there's no dialogue at all. It's an advert, and so you need to take notes about what's happened. Now, this is a McDonald's advert from a few years ago at Christmas, and I'd like you to make notes using the methods in your booklet. Now, those methods I'll talk about next, and you don't have to pause the video, you can hear me talking about the different techniques later. But what I want you to do is I want you to think about which is the most effective. Now, if we were in a classroom, what I usually ask students to do is put those notes up around the room, we'd comment on them, talk about the advantages and disadvantages. Instead, you're going to have to do this by yourself at home. But really what you'll find is that of the 4, one of them is not useful, and of the other 3, it's completely up to you as to which one you prefer. Now, there is one that I prefer and I try and use if I'm going to do any note taking. Likewise, there's another one that I actually encourage my students to use, and that's a different one. So there isn't necessarily a right or wrong of the 3, but there is certainly a wrong way of taking notes. So the first way in which you could take notes is called the Cornell Method of note-taking. And in actual fact, you've already seen the Cornell Method of note-taking in this video today. When I went through the SQ3R technique, you'll have seen that I organised the page into a series of lines and a series of columns. Now, the Cornell Method was created by the Cornell University in America, which is one of the top universities, and it's been popularized amongst most undergraduate courses across the world. And actually what a lot of universities will start doing is teaching you the Cornell Method in the first year of university. At Cornell, for example, they want all their students to do this. Essentially what you do is you have your page divided into a number of different columns and rows. At the very start, at the very top, you might want to write a heading. So it might be that you want to say what the general heading of this particular thing that you're making notes from is. It might be that you've got a number of different pages, so you might want to put the page number at the top left. So it might be that you've made 3 or 4 notes on one particular book, so you need to make sure that you've put the page number and that you've put today's date as well, because that's quite useful for when you're going back and trying to find sources that you haven't come across for a while. What students then do is they divide their page with a third column on the left hand side and a 2/3 column on the right hand side. The third column on the left hand side is where there are subheadings, and on the right hand side is where people then take notes from those subheadings. So if I was to do the thing that we've just looked at about Italy's birth rate, my subheading might be Italy versus UK population, and then my notes on the right hand side would be that shorthand that I've just written. What students sometimes do is at the end of each page they put a line at the bottom after having left a space. Now that space at the bottom, what sometimes students do is write down any key terms that they've just found out, or new things that they've just found out, or they provide a really short summary about what's on that page, or maybe keywords. And the Cornell method is the one that I encourage my history students to use at A-level. It's not one that I used when I was at school, but it might be something that you want to go for. The second method is the outlining method of note taking. So what that means is that this is quite useful to do on Microsoft Office, so things like Word documents. What you do is you take your subheading and you bullet point it so it's further on the left hand side. Each time that you make a subheading, you have a space indentation, and the major points therefore are the ones that are farthest to the left. If you're looking for specific points, they go to the right. So if you have a look at the one that you've got in front of you, it's about extrasensory perception. So a definition is important, and therefore I'm going to have that as a sub point, but actually the very specific points I'm going to indent even further. Now this can be quite useful for when you're trying to look at specifically new terminology or new concepts. So if you're doing A-levels, for example, a lot of students like to use this outlining method because it's quite easy to see specific key terms. They're not usually lost in a paragraph. So that might be something that you want to have a look at. The third approach is the one that I did most of my notes at A-level and undergraduate level on, and it's called the mapping method. Those that have done things like spider diagrams, mind maps, whatever you want to call them, it's very, very similar to that. It's essentially about drawing links and using the page not necessarily by writing down. It might be that you're combining links together, it might be that you're drawing arrows between different words, but essentially it's more of a visual display of your notes. There's no set way of doing this, but the usual premise is that there's a main theme in the very central of the page, and then around that are the major subcategories, and the further that you go away from the middle, the more specific the points become. So it's a bit similar in principle to the outlining method that I've just spoken to you about. The final method is the one that a lot of students decide to do at A-level when they have never taken notes before, and this is the one that I do not recommend that you do. It's called the skeleton prose method of note taking, and essentially it's just bullet points. It's bullet points of information. The problem with this particular approach is that messages and key points get lost. It's very difficult to find when you're looking back through notes the key information. And if I'm looking back at when I was taking notes in lectures at universities, when I was at university, this is what I did. And the reason why I haven't really utilized those notes ever is because it was really difficult to read back through. It was really complicated. There was no specificity of points. There was no categorization of information as being more important compared to others. And really it all became quite lost. So the reason why there's made up words that are on the screen is because after a while that's kind of how it looks when you're looking back through skeleton prose note taking. So if you haven't paused the video at this particular point, make sure that you look at that McDonald's clip and trial out one of those methods. Now on the lecture notes that you've got, that booklet that I've given you, it's also given some advantages and disadvantages. It's really important, however, that you don't do this skeleton prose. This is not the approach when taking notes, but do try and use one of those other approaches. Now in terms of reviewing those methods, think about which one you're going to employ, why you're going to use that particular approach. Incorporate your own note-taking style, that shorthand writing technique, and start looking at some of those documents and research that you can find using the internet. Really important that you record all of this down because again, we can utilize all this for marks when you're managing your project. So thanks very much for listening to this video. I know it's been quite a long video. My recommendations following this are to make a note of your record of initial ideas, send them through to me so that I can give you some advice and maybe give you some pointers, and then start collating your notes on your chosen topic area after you've decided which of those particular note-taking methods of either outlining, mapping, or the Cornell method, which one you want to use. Thanks very much for watching and for listening. If you've got any questions, just drop me an email.